You probably get an alert on your screen. And for most of the presentation, I'll be in presenter mode, so I'll be occupying the majority of the screen so you guys can see things that as I show them on camera. This is the first time. First of all, let me introduce myself. Greg Ricketts, just a hobbyist, antique tool enthusiast. I have been fooling around with restoring antique planes specifically for about 5 years, which is not a long time. My interest is primarily hardware and department store brands, particularly ones that were sold by Sears and Roebuck, for reasons that we won't get into a long story there. But I have way too many hand planes, well over 200 of them, and I've restored quite a few of my own and do work for clients as well. Also have japanned things besides hand planes. I have japanned woodwork. I've japanned other types of tools and exterior fittings for historic homes. So I've been fooling around with this for a while. So anyways, I wanted to welcome everybody and let you know that this is, in fact, the first time that I have done this seminar in a kind of a one-shot deal. I have done this, I think I've done it 3 or 4 times before, and I usually schedule an hour each Saturday over a 3-week period, and I cover 3 different phases of japanning a hand plane or restoring the hand plane. But I thought we'd try to do it in one go, and I think we'll do it in far less than 3 hours, I assure you. I'm going to squeeze down some of the information, but generally, when I was doing it before, I was wrapping up in 2.5 hours max, and I think we can get this done in probably 1.5 hours. And then depends on questions. And we're certainly going to stop a number of times throughout to let you ask questions. So bear with me on some of the technology. I've tried to set up in a manner to give you a pretty good experience, but I am operating in a makeshift shop right now because my shop is under construction, partially under demolition and partially under construction. So I'm actually working in the basement of the house. So if you wondering where you can do this, you can do it in your basement. Definitely work. And I have cured planes in the oven in the kitchen before, but that might be a discussion that you want to have with your housemates first. So at any rate, so we're going to cover everything from prepping a plane through mixing japanning and applying and heat curing japanning. I'm going to give you tips that I have learned along the way. I continue to learn every time I do this. My goal is for you to be successful the very first time you try to japan anything, a hand plane, hand tool, whatever it is you're going to japan. The reason for that, as we get into it, is the biggest amount of work that you're going to put into restoring the finish on an antique hand plane is removing the existing japanning. Far and away, that is the bulk of the work for most people. I happen to have had access to a media blaster. I've been doing media blasting for 40 years, and I have all that equipment. So for me, I can strip a plane down in about 5 minutes. But without that, it is at least it's an hour-long task that can be rather tedious. And I'll give you some tips on how to do it. But the last thing I ever want anybody to experience when they're japanning for their first time is to get a bad result and have to strip the plane and start over, because that's generally the solution to most of the errors in japanning. It's very difficult to correct a mistake. I'll give you some tips on that, but I want you to avoid the mistakes and have a successful outcome the very first time you do it, so you don't have to go back and strip off the fresh japanning, because that is absolutely the toughest japanning to get off, is the stuff you just finished applying. So, and you can absolutely do it. I've helped a lot of people get outstanding results. I can tell you there are folks that I've taught to do this that I think are better at it than I am. So they are getting outstanding results. So, I sent out an email. You should all have received a PDF file which has some of the materials you would need to go through the entire process. I don't know if you're planning on mixing your own japanning, or if you're going to acquire some of the commercially available japanning, but we'll cover that at any rate. I think it's kind of fun to make your own japanning, but it's also a little bit messy and a little time consuming. But I want to teach you everything kind of A to Z on it. So if you have a question, I am going to stop several times during the course of the presentation to allow for questions. But if something comes up, unmute and interrupt me and ask, because odds are somebody else has the same question. If it's slowing us down too much, we'll discuss it at that time and maybe press on. So how did I learn to do this? There is no school for Japanning. I did a lot of research for a couple of years, did a lot of digging through old texts, some of them dating from the late 1600s to 1700s. Really difficult to decipher the materials they're talking about in there, but found commonalities in those texts to the Japanning processes, and that was primarily as an art form. The 1700s, they started using Japanning on cast iron to protect it, and there's some written information about that. But a lot of it came from Ford Motor Company, which, if you heard some of the early conversation between myself and Tim Warren, the Model A's, the early Ford Model A's or Model T's were Japanned because that was the best paint available at the time. And while there's no book from Ford Motor Company on how to Japan them, there's some pretty well documented information out there about the process they used. I've also managed to acquire some information about Stanley's processes, their ovens, their curing process, the explosions they had in big walk-in ovens. There were a number of people killed at the Stanley plant over the years, and probably at others. Don't be afraid, you're not going to have an explosion in a toaster oven. These were very large walk-in ovens with an enormous amount of vapor in them. So at any rate, I've also done just a lot of trial and error, a lot of testing on various Japanning formulas. Like most of you, I've looked at probably all the YouTube videos and all the Google information that's out there. I've tried, fooled around with the varathane or polyurethane and asphaltum mixtures, what they call cold cure Japanning, and be happy to speak to that. It is a viable alternative. It's not nearly as durable as traditional Japanning, and it has a very narrow, I would say, margin for success. It's a narrow window for success. The traditional Japanning and the techniques that I'm going to show you are designed to provide a large window for success, a larger envelope for success, and reduce the chances of you stumbling into a problem with it. So I've fooled around with just about every different type. I've tried, if you've done some searching on Japanning, you've probably come across Old Pontypool, which is commercially produced Japanning sold by a company in New York. I do have a quart of that and have played around with it. It is a fine product. There's nothing wrong with it, but they do sell it in rather large quantities. A quart of Japanning will last you a lifetime. Well, it'll go bad before you use it up. And at $90 plus shipping, it's pretty expensive. Like I said, a quart of Japanning would probably Japan, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 hand planes. But it's a great product. There's absolutely nothing wrong with their product. I can't tell you exactly what's in it because they don't list the ingredients, but my experience with it would indicate that it's very much a traditional mix of boiled linseed oil, asphaltum, and turpentine. So, and as most of you may be aware, I also sell Japanning in very small quantities on the website. I started doing that when I started doing these seminars because there were people that didn't want to mix their own Japanning. I thought it would make it easier and more accessible to folks. I still do that. It's not my favorite thing to do, to mix a gallon of Japanning. It's a giant mess, but I still do it and make it available for folks. So that is another alternative. The little quart cans of Japanning that I sell, here I'll show you one. Seem pretty small. I get a lot of people that order 2 of them. But that'll do at least 10, maybe 12 or more number 4 size hand planes. In fact, that would probably do at least half a dozen number 8s. So it goes a long way. So let's talk about the material list just quickly, and then we'll get into how to use them. Traditional Japanning on cast iron, at least in the US and in a large part of Europe, is comprised primarily of turpentine, boiled linseed oil, and asphaltum. Asphaltum is also known as gilsonite. Gilsonite was a particular brand, or I guess maybe a particular mineral type of asphaltum that's mined in Utah, but it's all the same product. Here in the US, most of the time what you'll find is gilsonite for sale. Internationally, the best source I've found for asphaltum is Rublev, R-U-B-L-E-V, Rublev pigments for artist paint. And they sell gilsonite in reasonable quantities at reasonable prices. And I've managed to find it in Australia, most of Europe and Canada. So it's possible to purchase that locally or online in your own country. It is used, artists use it. They mix oil paint. They use the gilsonite, basically using Japanning, just like we use it on canvas for browns and blacks. It is essentially an oil-based paint, is really what you're making. Turpentine, there are two different primary types of turpentine. There is traditional turpentine, which is derived by essentially tapping pine trees, kind of like you tap for maple syrup, strip some of the bark off really, and collect the pine pitch that runs out of the tree, and then they purify and distill it. And most of the turpentine today, the vast majority of it is made from wood pulp, which they distill and extract the pine, the turpentine from that. I don't find any difference in performance in the two products. I have used the pulp produced turpentine for years. I am currently using a turpentine that is actually harvested in a traditional manner. A company called Sunshine produces that. I wouldn't say any one is better than the other. I will say that there are a few states, California is most notable here in the US, that have banned the sale of real turpentine and a lot of the other solvents that are common in paint and that type work because of the volatile organic compounds, the VOCs. I have not fooled around with the turpentine substitute to see if it works, because it's actually really hard to get here in Virginia because they haven't banned regular turpentine. If you can't get regular turpentine, I cannot tell you whether you'll be successful or not using a turpentine substitute. I don't know if the asphaltum will actually dissolve in it. So if that's an issue you're facing, feel free to reach out to me and I'll try to assist you with it in one way or another. If I can do some research on it, I'll try to do that and let you know the results. So linseed oil, again, I've not found a difference in brands of linseed oil. Off the stuff in the big box stores, boiled linseed oil works just fine. I have a brand that I'm using now only because it's available in very large containers. You do want boiled linseed oil. That is what was traditionally used in Japanning, not raw linseed oil. Boiled linseed oil has been around for hundreds of years. Right away, they figured out how to get linseed oil to cure faster. And that's essentially what the phrase boiled linseed oil refers to. It is primarily the addition of certain chemical dryers to the linseed oil that just help it cure more rapidly when exposed to air or heat in our case. If you use raw linseed oil, I don't know what kind of results you're going to get. I suspect you'd probably have to bake the finish for a very, very long time. So I wouldn't do it. There is also twice boiled linseed oil out there. I have not tried it. I would be hesitant to try it because it has a higher concentration of dryers so that it dries even faster. I have fooled around a lot with the use of Japan dryer, which if you look in the big box stores, you can find that in the paint section. It's used to help speed the curing of oil-based paints. And I have tried it try to find a method to cure Japanning on cast iron without the use of heat, because that can be a challenge for folks. There is an extraordinarily narrow margin of error with Japan dryers on cast iron. You're far more likely to end up with a completely unacceptable finish if you try it. It works great on wood. I use it when I Japan wood products, but on cast iron, the use of Japan dryers in Japan in a traditional Japan mix is definitely not recommended. And as such, the double boiled linseed oil, which has a higher concentration of dryers, I think would be likely to cause the same problem. And the problem is the Japanning basically skins over before the linseed oil polymerizes and the VOCs escape, and you get a very wrinkled finish, which you'd be really unhappy with. So traditional boiled linseed oil is definitely the way to go. We talked a little bit about asphaltum. Asphaltum is essentially petrified oil. It's a petroleum-based mineral, hard mineral that is mined in big chunks and then ground, in our case, ground very fine. It's passed generally through a 200 mesh screen. I wouldn't get anything that was coarser. You can find coarser asphaltum out there. I've found it internationally. Malaysia mines a lot of it. But you want a very fine product because you want to remove contaminants and you want it to dissolve rapidly. And the stuff you'll find either on eBay, or I do get my Japanning from the eBay seller. If you do a search on eBay in the US for gilsonite asphaltum, you'll find a seller who's located in Colorado who sells it by the pound. A pound of asphaltum will last you a lifetime. That will make an enormous amount of turpentine or an enormous amount of Japanning, but it's excellent quality. Here's what it looks like. That's like a 1 pound container that he sells. So it's definitely an option. The Rublev gilsonite, I believe, is exactly the same thing. It's sold in much smaller quantities. Might be a consideration. This stuff is very much like copier toner. It gets everywhere. So use caution when you're handling it. I also sell very small quantities of gilsonite, enough to mix one of these 1/4 pint containers. I just package the gilsonite in here in the appropriate amount to add turpentine and end up with that. I primarily do that in some of the countries where people couldn't get it, and I could ship a real small quantity to them relatively affordably. But it's not nearly as cost effective as buying the Rublev or buying from the gentleman on eBay. I'll be perfectly frank. You're also buying the container. So at any rate, I'm not in this for the money. So yeah, obviously I'm not promoting my products very well. I just make them available if you can't find them elsewhere. You need good quality brushes for applying Japanning. I initially tried using just the cheap disposable chemical brushes, and you'll leave brush marks. Japanning has great self-leveling qualities, but a better brush, a finer brush, will get you better results. The Taclon type of nylon bristles seem to work really well. They're readily available on Amazon. They're very affordable. I used a set like I'm showing that you see on your handout. I used that for a couple of years, finally kind of wore them out, and just bought some new ones recently. They're very inexpensive and clean with turpentine and will last a long time. So make sure you get at least one extremely fine brush. See if I can show you here. Because when you're working on the frog, there are some very, very tight areas, and you want a very fine brush to be able to apply around the lateral lever. So most of these kits come with these extremely fine brushes, and if your eyes are like mine, get some good reading glasses. So other things you'll need, something to container to put some turpentine in to rinse your brushes. Use a little metal container, and you can actually, if you're mixing more Japanning, you can save the turpentine that you rinse your brushes in that's now stained black from the asphaltum and use it to mix the next batch. It's just pigment. You'll need some rags, maybe something relatively lint-free. Just old cotton pillowcases work fine. Some latex or nitrile gloves to keep the oils of your hands off the surface you're going to Japan, and maybe keep the Japanning off you. Acetone is what I recommend for wiping the plane.
Tim, we lost sound if you can hear us. Or Greg.
Okay, am I back?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much for pointing that out. All right. So again, the most effective way to strip a hand plane for Japanning is media blasting, glass bead media, 70 grit. Glass at about 60 to 70 PSI will remove almost all Japanning very quickly. But not something that's readily available to everybody. So other methods for removing the Japanning, soaking the plane in lacquer thinner is pretty effective at loosening the Japanning. It's the most effective solvent I've come across. I've tried soaking in turpentine. I have tried soaking in evaporust because people talk about that removing the finish. I've soaked in, what is that, green, something green cleaner, popular, I can't remember, it's used popularly in people that are removing rust from their planes. Simple green, I've soaked in simple green for days, weeks. Turpentine after a week will soften the Japanning a little bit. Lacquer thinner overnight will soften it about as good as anything else. So if you're going to use a chemical method, lacquer thinner helps soften it. It doesn't completely remove it or dissolve it, but it can make it a little easier to subsequently scrape off. You want to completely immerse the plane. Easy way to do that on a larger plane is just get a piece of PVC pipe that your plane barely fits in. Take the frog off so it fits in a small tube. You can glue a PVC cap on the other end, and the glue is not affected by the lacquer thinner. I have tested that. I've soaked PVC joints in lacquer thinner for weeks, and they hold up. So you can build a little PVC tube, slide your plane in there, and then add lacquer thinner to it. That way you don't have to buy 5 gallons of lacquer thinner. I've also heard where people, there's some type of like wallpaper tray that you can use that's fairly small to put a plane in. I looked at the trays that are used for drywall mud. They're not watertight, so don't use that. Everything will spill out on the floor. And then as far as removing the Japanning, you can just basically, once it's softened a little bit, or if it's not, you can do it without softening it. You can scrape it off using a blunted chisel. Just a cheap old everyday chisel. It works probably a little better if the edge is actually blunt and squared off. This one is still somewhat pointed, but if you blunt it, it works quite well. Screwdriver works fairly well. Any kind of scraper will remove the Japanning. Make sure you wear protective goggles when you're doing that, because the Japanning kind of flies off in little tiny particles and as it kind of shatters off the plane and can get in your eyes. A Dremel tool with the small wire brushes is pretty effective at removing Japanning as well. I would recommend that you scrape most of it off before you use the Dremel tool. Otherwise, you'll go through a ton of the little wire brushes. And again, wear safety glasses. Those little wire wheels on the Dremels fling off the little bristles, and you certainly don't want one in the eye. So, but they work quite well. You can get various size cups that can get in a lot of small spots on the planes off of Amazon relatively inexpensively. So that's an effective way to remove it. I would not recommend trying to burn the Japanning off. I had somebody ask me that once. I don't think you really want to ignite Japanning and be breathing what's coming out of there. Some of the old Japanning chemicals that were used in the boiled linseed oil were lead-based. So I don't think you want to be breathing the fumes of trying to burn it off. So. All right. You'll need some measuring spoons, something to measure. If you're going to mix your own Japanning, something to measure out the products. You're going to do everything by volume, not by weight. If you the traditional ratio of Japanning is about 40% linseed oil, 40% asphaltum, and 20% or 40% turpentine. I'm sorry, 40% turpentine, 40% linseed oil, and 20%. I'm messing it up again. I'm sorry. 40% turpentine, 40% asphaltum, and 20% linseed oil. So 442. And that's by volume. If you do it by weight, you will have a very, very, very thick goo that will not be Japanning. The asphaltum weighs virtually nothing, so it's all by volume. So some kind of measuring spoon. You need something to stir it with, just a wooden stick. We'll stir a small quantity of Japanning. If you're going to mix a quart, you might get a small paint stirrer that you can put on the end of a drill. Something like this. Works very well in a quart can if you're going to mix that much. And lastly, you need a curing oven. You need some source of heat to cure the Japanning. And that is the other, I think, most difficult thing for folks to overcome. I've added on there a small toaster oven that I started with. That toaster oven that I put in that parts list is generally available on Amazon. It'll hold up to a number 6 size plane diagonally in there. The body will just fit. But what do you do if you want to do a larger one? Well, I did build an extended toaster oven using 2 of those toaster ovens, and those plans are available on my website. However, that has a fairly limited lifespan. Mine lasted about a year and a half, 2 years, because you're asking a lot of the heating element to heat a larger space in that toaster oven. You can certainly cure in a kitchen oven, and I have done it. If you don't find the smell of turpentine particularly offensive, it's not all that bad. It's basically the same as if you took a can of turpentine, took the lid off of it, and sat it in the kitchen for a couple of hours. That's what it's going to smell like. So if that doesn't bother you, it's fine. It doesn't do anything to your oven. I baked cookies in the oven right after I finished curing the japanning. It's fine. It doesn't affect the oven at all. But if you don't want to have the smell of japanning in the household oven, which I can certainly understand, I am currently curing a plane outside on my barbecue grill right now. I'm monitoring the temperature on a remote thermometer, and I do know someone who has successfully done this, and the challenge simply is regulating the temperature, but you can certainly cure a plane on a gas barbecue grill, and my barbecue grill will hold a number 8 size plane. So I think most people's will. So that might be the ticket to your success, or to getting more folks up on japanning, is that might be a very readily available way to cure planes. I'll let you know what the results are, but I expect it to work out just fine. The biggest challenge I have had with my grill is getting it to stay cool enough for the initial curing cycle. The grill, even with just one of 3 burners running, is running a little hotter than I would normally like, but I think it's still within the window of success. So we'll know the results here before we're done today. I'll be going out there and pulling it off the grill after the first curing cycle, and we'll see if we were successful. So at this point, I want to take just a short break and see if anybody has any questions about the materials you'll need to start out japanning. So any questions? All right. Well, if you have a question, I'll remind you, you have to unmute. So if you were talking and I didn't hear you, try it one more time. Just unmute and fire away. All right, then we'll press on. One thing I want to mention before we go on, and I've got it highlighted in red on my notes here, is safe handling of boiled linseed oil. If you're not aware of this, boiled linseed oil on rags can spontaneously ignite. And I have firsthand experience with that, as a home that was my neighbors just directly behind me. They were refinishing the floors. When they were done staining the floors, they threw all the rags in the trash bin on the back porch. And about 2 hours after the workers left, the trash can caught on fire and caught the house on fire and the house next to it on fire. Boiled linseed oil is a polymerizing oil. So it is exothermic. As it cures, and when exposed to oxygen, it produces heat, and it produces enough heat to ignite cotton rags, linen rags, certainly paper towels. If you put them in a heap, and it doesn't take much at all, and they're wet with linseed oil, it can ignite. So best thing to do is to either lay them out somewhere on a piece of concrete until they're dry, completely dry, or put them in a sealed container of water, anything you're using around linseed oil. So don't burn your shop down. I've seen plenty of videos of garage fires. You can find them out there, and it's pretty common with linseed oil. So, all right, let's talk just for a minute about the plane selection itself. Certainly, you can do block planes and bench planes. I will tell you, block planes are actually a little more difficult. There's some tight spaces. They usually have multiple surfaces, like the cap. Can be is japanned on both sides. So a little trickier, but they're certainly smaller and a smaller investment of time. So, but bench planes are a very easy way to start. They're quite easy to access. Now, as far as condition of the plane, you can start with anything. This is a pretty nasty rusted hand plane with very little Japanning left on it. Hopefully you're not acquiring ones like this, but I do. In fact, I get a lot of them like this. I enjoy saving them. Did want to point out on this, if you're not aware of it, Japanning is a very high gloss finish. And we're not used to that when we look at antique hand planes, because the Japanning usually has a pretty healthy layer of embedded grime, both on the surface and somewhat embedded in the Japanning. The Japanning has, been subject to a lot of wipe downs and has been kind of micro etched or abraded over 100 years. And so we're used to it being a kind of a flat finish. But if you look under the tote of a hand plane right here, you can see even on this terrible plane, you see that gloss. It is a very high gloss finish. So, and when you Japan a plane, it's a very high gloss finish. That was the attraction of it. So if you're expecting to look like a 100-year-old hand plane when you're done Japanning it, it's going to look like a factory fresh finish Japanning. You can dull that down with like some 5,000 grit sandpaper and basically just give it 100 years of surface scuffing and end up with a finish that looks maybe more appropriate to the patina of your plane, if that's what you like. But it is a high gloss finish. So, but a plane this rusty and missing this much Japanning, there's an advantage here. First of all, there's not a lot of work stripping the Japanning off one like this, but you do have to get all the rust off. Just like anything else, you guys are well aware. If you put the Japanning on a surface that is not well bonded or really clean, then when whatever is on your plane turns loose, your Japanning will come off as well. So you got to get all the rust off. If you use a wire wheel, you're going to remove it pretty much using the wire wheel as you strip it down. You may want to use on one this bad, you would probably want to soak this in a rust remover because that is really, really bad. All right, let me switch the camera back here. Block planes, I don't want to dissuade you from doing a block plane. I do lots of them. They're a lot of fun. Probably the most difficult block plane I've done are the little, I don't know the Stanley models. I think it's like a 130. It's the double-ended block plane where the blade it's basically a bullnose on one side and a traditional plane on the other with no depth adjustment. That has really tight clearances between the frog and the cheek of the plane. It's pretty difficult to get a brush in there to Japan it, but it can be done. So if you're starting with that, it might be a little bit more difficult, but otherwise the rest of the block planes are pretty easy. Working around the mouth of an adjustable block plane, you want to be real cognizant of what you Japan and what you don't Japan. And that gets us back into plane preparation. Before you strip a plane, the first thing you really want to do is a little inventory on exactly what surfaces are Japanned. Now, traditionally, the way they Japanned a hand plane is they took the entire body right after they cut off the flashings from the casting. So there's like a I don't remember what it's called. Where the metal goes through the molds and joins all the molds together. So that's roughly cut off the plane, and then the entire body is completely submerged in a large vat of Japanning, removed and allowed to kind of drip off before it goes into an oven. So 100% of the plane was Japanned, but none of it had been machined yet. They didn't remove the Japanning, they milled the plane, and in the process milled the Japanning off. So that's why you have some surfaces that aren't Japanned. The cheeks were milled, the sole was milled, the frog seat was milled, the holes were drilled and tapped. So you can, when the mouth was cut, that's why the Japanning was removed there. But in some cases, the early Stanley planes, the top rails of the cheeks were not machined. So you'll find on the early ones where the cheek is rounded, they were actually Japanned. Now it wears off pretty quickly there, so it's kind of difficult to be certain of your plane. But if you look closely, on the older Stanleys, usually it's the type maybe 7s and earlier. They didn't do any kind of milling to the cheek rail at all. And it was actually Japanned. Yeah, this is an old Sigley plane right here. This was Sigley produced by Stanley. So this is about a 19, This is a 1903 plane, right after Stanley, or 1903, after Stanley bought Sigley. But this one, they did not do any kind of work on the cheek rails, so it was japanned, and I put the japanning back on the cheek rail itself on the top. On something newer, like a bedrock, you can see how the rail was flattened off. I don't remember exactly what that process was called. It wasn't done with a mill. It was done basically against a sanding belt, that they flattened that off and smoothed out the casting. And of course, in the process, removed the japanning from that surface. So on the newer Stanleys and the bedrocks, the top of the rail is not japanned. But you want to know what is japanned and what isn't, particularly on the block planes. You want to take maybe take a picture of the mouth of the block plane, the movable mouth part, where the mouth seats, so you know what to japan and what not to japan. Generally, I don't put any japanning anywhere two metal surfaces are going to mate together, because you may be adding thickness that wasn't originally there, and you're not going to get as good of a mating surface. So that's kind of a rule of thumb. The exception to that, in the way I japan planes, is the pin that holds the Y yoke in place. I don't remove the Y yoke to japan the plane. You can get the japanning on the pin. It doesn't freeze it in place. The japanning is not a powerful adhesive by any stretch. The yoke it frees up just as soon as you move it. But that pin traditionally would not have been japanned. It would have been installed later. So if you want to be really traditional in your japanning, then you would want to remove the Y yoke, japan it separately, and then put the pin back in place. But I don't do that because there's a little bit of risk driving those pins out of cracking a frog. I don't think it's worth the risk. And I think it's a detail that's very difficult to see. So I just don't think it's worth the risk doing it. I do japan around the lateral lever, this pocket right in here. Let me get you a better camera here with better lighting. Here we go. The pocket around the lateral lever, you can japan it simply by moving the lever to one side, japanning one side, moving it to the other, japanning that side, and then running it through the bake cycles. Removing this is very tricky. It's very easy to break the top off of a frog doing it. You have to grind the rivet out, and when you put the new rivet in, it's quite easy to break a frog. So again, I don't think it's worth the risk. And you can japan all but about 1% that's directly under the lateral lever right next to the pin, which is never seen and is, I don't think, an issue. So I also typically will not try to remove the depth adjuster stud. These are often frozen into the frog and very difficult to remove, particularly without damaging these threads. They're fairly fine threads. There's a lot of different techniques for removing these, using some leather on a pair of pliers, wrapping them in solder. The solder crushes into the threads and the threads are not as damaged by it. But these things are typically frozen in really tight and difficult to remove. And it's pretty easy to japan around it with that small brush. So I wouldn't remove that just to japan. If it's loose, by all means, take it out. But if it's welded in there from corrosion, I wouldn't fight with it to get it out. If you ever do want to remove these, I can tell you the absolute safest way to do it is to get the appropriate die, an adjustable die, which I do have manufactured and available. I don't know if you can get them off the regular market. I think they're a British Standard Whitworth thread. I'd have to look. But you can take an adjustable die and take the adjustment screw out of it, put the die on here because it matches the threads perfectly, and then clamp the die with a pair of vice grips. And it clamps into those threads really tight, and you can then unscrew these from the frog. So if you have a reason to remove one, that's the way to do it without damaging it. All right. So you've looked at the plane, you've documented where it's japanned, where it's not japanned. You know where you're going to put japanning and where you're going to leave it clear of japanning. You've removed all the components, woodwork, frog, taken apart your block plane, the brass parts, everything down to the smallest stage. You've got it all stripped and cleaned and ready to go. And so now it's time to mix some japanning. So let's talk about that. We covered the ingredients. There are definitely some techniques to mixing it that can make it a lot easier for you and help you be successful. And all of those are learned from experience. And I have definitely thrown away some Japanning mixes in my learning. So here's some of the tips. First of all, whatever container you're going to mix in, metal container, measure out the amount of turpentine you're going to use first and put the turpentine in the container first. If you put the asphaltum in first and you add turpentine to it, it's really hard to get the asphaltum scraped off the bottom of the container and get it all suspended and exposed to the turpentine to dissolve. So turpentine first, asphaltum second. In the Japanning mixture, your only thickening agent is asphaltum. The turpentine and the linseed oil don't thicken it at all. And either one of those two products is much too thin in its normal state. If your Japanning was as thin as your linseed oil, you would have mixed it too thin. So you're counting on the asphaltum to help thicken the material to about the consistency of something between honey and syrup you would put on your pancakes. A little thinner is better than too thick. So I would start out with using a ratio of turpentine to Japanning that's about 60-40. More turpentine than Japanning. Now, I used to recommend it the other way around, but I've found that if you get too much asphaltum in your turpentine, it won't all dissolve, and you're left with that those particles of undissolved asphaltum in your Japanning mix, which can become contaminants when you're applying the Japanning and trying to get a good finish. So we want to minimize the any undissolved asphaltum in our Japanning. So start out with not a 50-50 ratio, but a 60-40 ratio of turpentine to asphaltum. You want to just add the asphaltum to the turpentine, stir it really well for a couple of minutes, put the lid on your can. You can shake it at that point. It doesn't matter. Normally you're not going to shake Japanning, but when you're mixing it, mixing turpentine and asphaltum, you can certainly agitate it as much as you like. And it will be extremely watery. You will absolutely think you have messed up and not added anywhere near enough Japanning, because the Japanning will almost instantly dissolve into the turpentine. After you're done stirring it, put the lid on it, set it aside, let it sit for a few hours, and come back, and it will have gotten appreciably thicker. It thickens up fast. In fact, if you mix it 50-50, you're going to come back and it's going to be almost like Jello. So that's why we're going to start out 60-40. So at that point, you let it sit for 4 hours, let it sit overnight. You can let it sit as long as you want. In fact, when I mix large quantities of Japanning, I don't add the linseed oil until I'm ready to use it, because it will eventually cure. It does have a shelf life. So for example, this quart of Japanning right here, this is actually just linseed, or just turpentine and asphaltum. There's no linseed oil in this yet. And I won't add the linseed oil until I need it, because I've got enough right now. You're going to be mixing small quantities, so you'll end up going through the whole process. But at any rate, let it sit overnight, or at least 4 hours, and then come back and stir it again and see how thick it is. If it's not as thick as honey, then you're going to add small quantities of asphaltum, stir, let it sit for 3 or 4 hours, check it again until your turpentine and asphaltum mixture is about the thickness of honey. You're going to start out with that a little thicker than what you want in your end product, because your linseed oil will thin it down slightly. And again, so you're looking for something like honey. Small quantities of asphaltum until you sneak up on that thickness mixture. And you're going to find in the end, you're going to be pretty close to a 50-50 ratio. So once you finally got your turpentine and asphaltum mixed, and it's reached the appropriate thickness, like honey, you've been stirring it, process might take a day or two as you gain experience, you're now going to add the linseed oil to it. So your final ratio is going to be 80% of turpentine and asphaltum to 20% Japanning. So whatever volume you have in one of these containers, you're going to basically you're going to have about, if I recall, I think it's I'd have to look. The instructions are on it, but let's say you were using tablespoons and you had 4 tablespoons of turpentine, 4 tablespoons of asphaltum, essentially mixed together. You're then going to add 2 tablespoons of linseed oil. You don't want to be too light on the linseed oil. If anything, be a little heavy on linseed oil. Otherwise, your Japanning just takes much longer to cure. You're going to run longer heat cycles or more heat cycles. So a little heavier on the linseed oil is, if you're not sure, is a good place to go. Add linseed oil, stir it all up again, let it sit for a few hours, come back and check your thickness. You should be pretty much spot on. If you're still a little thick, I would then add a little turpentine, a little linseed oil till you get to where you want to be, but you should be right on at that point. So at that point, the next thing to do is to be patient. You can either, there will still be undissolved particles in there. When they grind up the gilsonite or asphaltum, there's some minerals that get in there that are not gilsonite, they're rock, that are not going to dissolve, and you want to either let those settle out. This is how Stanley and all the companies that did Japanning back in the day did this. They had enormous vats of Japanning where they could dunk, pretty large objects in there. And those things just were, undisturbed. They never went back and stirred it. So the bottom of it was probably a couple inches of undissolved material. Anything undissolved slowly sinks down through the Japanning. So my best recommendation is let it sit for a week at room temperature, at least 72 degrees. 72 to 80 degrees. It's a little thinner at those temperatures, and any undissolved material will sink to the bottom of the Japanning. You can speed up the process by filtering the Japanning, and I have a short video on filtering it. I'm not going to demonstrate it because it's pretty messy, but I'll describe it. And like I said, there's a video on my website if you want to filter small quantities at home. It's pretty straightforward. Just wearing gloves and taking a good quality cotton sheet, which is usually about 400 thread count. You can put it in a funnel, which will hold it for you. Pour your Japanning into the cotton sheet, gather it all up. At that point, I put it in a basically like an icing bag or a baggie with the corner cut out to basically encase it in plastic. And then you just start twisting the back end, which forces the Japanning through the linen and does a very good job filtering out 90% of the particles. And you just squeeze it out into a can, but it's messy. You get it on your gloves. You'll lose some Japanning in the process. You can scrape it off and save 80% of it, and pretty much be ready to go at that point. You don't necessarily have to wait for it then to settle out. Although, again, letting it settle is always the best way to go. Once you've finished mixing it, you've let it settle, or you've filtered it and you've got it in the can, don't ever shake it again. Don't turn it upside down. If you drop the can, put it on the shelf, let it sit for a week, because there will be undissolved material that gets to the bottom of the can, and that's where you want it to stay forever. You don't want to ever dip your brush all the way to the bottom, because your brush will get all those undissolved particles. You'll see them in your finish and you won't like it. So be careful handling Japanning. When I ship the Japanning, I always tell people, put it on the shelf, let it sit at room temperature for a couple of days before you use it. Because even though I filter it through a pretty sophisticated filter, there's still going to be some particles in there, and they get mixed up in shipping. So let it sit. That's the best thing. And truthfully, your Japanning mixture just gets better and better as it sits on the shelf to a point. So, all right. Any questions about mixing Japanning? Don't forget to unmute if you have a question.
Yeah, hi, this is, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, it's Vlad. You just mentioned it can sit on a shelf to a point. Once it is mixed, what do you think is the shelf life?
That's a great question. I used to tell people I thought it was pretty much unlimited, but I had a can of Japanning that I let get down to, all these small cans. I probably had maybe 1/8 of an inch of Japanning left in the bottom of it. So it was 90% air. And it sat for probably a month because I was using a different container. And when I came back to it, it had thickened appreciably. And that thickening is the result of the linseed oil polymerizing, hardening. The linseed oil it forms cross-linked long chain polymers, and that's basically what makes it harden and why it's such a durable material. It does it very slowly at room temperature, but in the presence of oxygen, it does harden. And once it does that, adding turpentine to it will thin it down again, but it doesn't unpolymerize the linseed oil. And so while it'll be thin again and you could apply it, it won't harden. It won't cure very well at all. So I would say I would probably count on my Japanning. If the can's really full and there's very little air in it, 6 months to a year. But once you have, a third of the can used up, whatever your container is, I would say I would probably consider the shelf life to be somewhere between 3 and 6 months. There's a couple of things you can do to extend it. Probably the very best thing you could do is just put some inert gas in the can before you seal it back up. Sounds complicated, but it's really pretty easy. You can get what they call wine preserver. It's just argon gas and what looks like a spray paint can. Argon is an inert gas. It's cheap. It's like, I don't know, $6 for a can of this stuff, and it'll last you forever. And you just spray the gas into the can. It's heavier than air, so you just spray it in there. It displaces the oxygen, and it'll leave a layer of argon gas that's invisible, and then you seal it up. And now you're not oxidizing the material. Another popular thing people do with people do this with any kind of varathane or polyurethane finish is you can put clean marbles, glass marbles or glass bearings, or really clean stones in there and keep the level of your Japanning up at the top of the can. So as you use some of the material, you put a marble or two in there and it raises the level back up. So there's very little oxygen in the can. So those are two ways to extend the shelf life. But if your can's half empty and you've got a pretty good sized surface area of oxygen, it is slowly curing in the can. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I have one other question.
Yeah.
We kind of jumped from the bead blasting, excuse me, the bead blasting process over to the actual recipe and so on. But the cleaning of surfaces.
Right.
You did mention acetone. Is that what you are endorsing?
So as far as getting the surface, all the old Japanning removed, again, you can scrape it off. Lacquer thinner helps soften it and remove it. Wire wheels take it off effectively with a Dremel. And of course, media blasting removes it very well. You want to have all the rust and essentially all the old Japanning off. Now, if you've got a little spot of old Japanning and it's just really stubborn and it's really stuck, you don't really have to worry about it because it's well adhered to the bed of the plane. So the Japanning that goes on top of that is going to adhere to it. The old Japanning stuck to the plane. I would sand it down so you don't have like a sharp edge around a small area. And that kind of starts getting into the whole spot repair of Japanning, which is a different subject. But once you're down to basically clean metal, and this is an example of a plane that's been media blasted. Again, let me get you a better camera here so you can see what it looks like. Here we go. So that is quite clean, although you can see a little spot right here, and that spot is something that got on here, probably some kind of an oil that dripped on here, so I'll wipe that down. But there's essentially no Japanning left on this bed at all. It's extremely clean. That's what you get with media blasting, but you don't have to go to this extent before you Japan. You're going to have, if you're using the scraping methods and wire brushes, you're going to have a little bit of a black cast. You may have a little bit of Japanning left in the pores of the plane, but you do have to have all the rust off. So you can remove that rust mechanically, or you can use any type of a rust remover. There's a lot of debate on different rust removers. I will tell you that I've done a lot of testing with Evaporust, which is a chelation agent. There are other brands that do the same thing. They chelate the rust off. There's electrolysis, which is great. If you have access to electrolysis equipment, you really can't go wrong with that. But if you don't, the chelation agents are very effective at getting all the rust off. If you have rust left in the pores, it will come back and eventually loosen the Japanning from underneath. So you have to have a rust-free surface. But then before I apply the Japanning, as you can tell, I'm touching the plane, I'm handling it. There's oils in our hands. If I don't come back and make sure I've got those oils off before I apply the Japanning won't adhere right here, and you'll have a definite spot with bare metal showing. So I'll wipe the entire plane down with acetone. After I media blast, I blow it off, brush it off, get the debris off of it from the media blasting, but then I wipe it down with acetone. So hopefully that answers your question. Right before I Japan, wipe the whole thing down with acetone. There's nothing left on it. You can use turpentine as well to wipe it down. The turpentine, it just has more odor and takes a little longer to kind of dry. You don't want to have a lot of, turpentine left on here as you're applying your Japanning, because it will thin your Japanning down and won't be quite what you expect. But I use acetone for that process. That answer your question, Glad?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Any other questions?
Yeah, Greg, I got some.
Go ahead.
Hey, my typical thinking is I'm gonna take a little junk block plane and clean off some of the bottom of it and just test my painting skills and that kind of thing before I try to do a real one.
Yep.
And if I come out with a bad result, I got more little block planes to practice on.
Sure.
That type of thing. Another thing I was wondering, you answered my question, if left a little bit of old Japanning somewhere, what would happen over top of it?
Yeah.
So you don't think there's an adhesion problem?
No.
If there's a little bit in a corner somewhere or something.
Yeah. Not really. Just make sure that it's that it's very clean. Hang on a sec. My hand plane on the barbecue is done.
Is it time to go get it?
Yeah, I'm gonna. We'll take a break here in a minute. I'll go shut it off and let it cool down. Keep in mind, these things are hot. I have made the mistake of reaching in the oven and grabbing one, thinking it was it'd been half an hour, and then I had two seared handprints on the side of the hand plane to clean off. But if the Japanning is really stuck well, I would sand it down so that it doesn't have a glossy finish, that you don't have any sharp edges around it. Even though Japanning does a great job of self-leveling, it does still kind of reflect the shape of what's underneath it. So if you sand down around the edges with some 80 grit, or 800 grit, or really even 600 grit sandpaper on any Japanning that's left in an area that just doesn't want to turn loose, I think you're fine. Yeah, and the new Japanning will adhere to it, no problem.
Yeah, good. Now, if we're trying to be one of these perfect restorers, those guys will take and file the frog base and the frogs and that and make them all match. I would think if you was going to do that, you'd want to do that before you Japanned it, rather than risk scratching up your Japanning.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dennis, and it was something I meant to cover. Yes, I generally recommend that anything you're going to do to restore the plane, as far as any lapping or alignment of parts or anything like that, you do it before you Japan. Because you don't want to scratch the new Japanning. It is possible to scratch it, particularly with tools that you might be using, and it's very difficult to repair Japanning and get a good finish. It's much easier to put an entire coat of Japanning on. So and again, that's the voice of experience. The first time I Japanned one, I hadn't cleaned the cheeks off, and then later in the process of cleaning the cheeks, I slipped and put a big old scuff mark right across the Japanning on the plane. So that was a great question, Dennis.
That's it for me.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions?
Greg, I do have a question.
Yeah.
When you're talking about putting the Japanning on areas, and then you talked about the top of the cheeks.
Yes.
Would you tape off the side?
Excellent question. That's one of the advantages I find to using Japanning, is you don't have to mask anything. The Japanning is very easy to manipulate with the brush because it's kind of thick. It doesn't just run onto the surfaces. You kind of have to nudge it onto the surface. So it's easy to do very precision work around tight spaces or around the frog seats and such as you're Japanning. And if you slip and swipe your brush across the frog seat, you can just take your somewhat lint-free cotton rag and just dampen it with just a little bit of turpentine in your finger and just wipe that surface and the Japanning will come right off.
Okay.
So yeah, so as far as the cheeks go, when I'm Japanning the plane, I'm brushing up on the cheek. Let me get a brush out and show you, because I'm actually going to throw some Japanning on this plane for you, but show you the technique. So I would be brushing up this way, not down this way where I would get a lot of Japanning on the cheek, but brushing up. But even still, there'll be, you know, some Japanning on the cheek. So before I put it in the oven, the last thing I do is take my rag, a bit of turpentine, and I just make a pass along the cheek rail like so. Cleans it right off. So same thing, you know, anywhere else that you get it, you'll get it maybe frequently, you'll get a little bit on the mouth.
Yep.
As you're doing the front of the mouth inside, just wipe it off. So,
Okay.
yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really nice not to have to mask the plane, because that, to me, masking was tedious. So and you'll definitely, you know, I mean, you will definitely be doing that when you do the frog. You will get Japanning on a surface of the frog that you don't want it on, and it's easy to wipe off. If you forget to wipe it off and you bake it, you just use your Dremel and you can, you know, with a little wire wheel and some caution, yeah, you can remove it again and clean it back up. So, any other questions before we go on? All right. Well, I'll tell you what, I am going to put the camera on pause for just a second. I'm going to go shut off the grill and let that plane cool down so that we can take a look at a plane that has come off the barbecue grill with one coat of Japanning on it and one heat cycle. So be a good chance for you to freshen up your cup of coffee, and I'll be back in about 3 minutes. Okay. Make sure my microphone's on. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. All right, I grabbed a couple of hot pads and just grabbed the plane right off the grill. So we'll get to take a look at it here in a minute and see what it looks like. It's just one coat of Japanning on one of my test bed planes. So I'm not going to tell you that it's my best workmanship, because I'm really fooling around with the barbecue more than anything. But actually, it looks pretty good. As soon as it's cool enough to handle, I'll hold it up to the camera. So we'll take a look. A couple things that you will come across if you do some research on Japanning. You might find mention of lamp black as a pigment in Japanning, and that's all the asphaltum is a pigment, and it's the thickening agent. Lamp black, I think, was used where asphaltum wasn't available. It's basically just soot. It's, you know, from incomplete combustion. And I know somebody that does use lamp black in their mixture. It's just another pigment, and it works just fine. It was not what was used on Stanley planes. They were using asphaltum because they had access to it, but you can certainly fool around with it. I have. It's just as messy as asphaltum, if not a little more messy and in dry state. The other thing you'll come across is mentioned in some of the really old texts of Damar resin. That was used to, I think, control, maybe add gloss to the finish. It looks to me, from what I've been able to research, the Damar resin was probably used more in the artistic community for traditional Japan lacquer work than on the cast iron. But I do know somebody who is using Japanning that has Damar resin added to the Japanning mix, and it performs fine. But there's really don't see any visible difference in the finished product, and no difference in performance. So it to me is an unnecessary step to acquire Damar resin, to grind it, to dissolve it, and to add it to the product. So, but those are things that you may come across. One of the other questions I get a lot too is, you know, how about Japanning in other colors? Ohio Tool Company did use a red Japanning. It's possible the Modern Grinder Company, which are the hand planes that have the shark logo. They're cast iron Bailey bench plane. They look like a standard Bailey plane, but they have the shark logo on the blade, which actually is because the blades are made in Sweden. The shark logo is a logo associated with a community in Sweden that made high quality steel. And the Modern Grinder company, which I think was in Michigan, was importing those blades or getting them from Canada, which was getting them from Sweden. Anyways, their planes were red, and they may have been Japan, but there's very few of those planes around, and I haven't examined one to figure out if it's enamel or not. But Ohio Tool Company did, for 2 years, do red Japan planes. It's kind of a maroon color. And I have fooled around with a number of different colored pigments, including a number of different reds in Japanning. And I can, what I will tell you about that is it's very, very difficult. I think there's a reason Ohio only did it for a couple of years, and there's a reason most of the red Ohio planes you find are lacking a lot of Japanning, is that the coloring agents, the red, for example, was vermilion. They don't dissolve in turpentine. So they're a very small particle in suspension in the Japanning. So it's difficult to get a smooth finish using those agents. The Japanning has to be stirred before it's applied because they're in emulsion and they dissolve. They settle out. The pigment agents do, other than asphaltum, which dissolves. So it's possible to color Japanning, but it's really difficult to do it, which is why it was black. That's why you could get your Model T in any color as long as it was black. So, all right. So let's talk about actually applying the Japanning. You've mixed it now. You've prepped your plane. You've mixed Japanning. You maybe filtered it, which is, don't let me dissuade you. There's about a 3-minute or 5-minute video on the website on how to filter it using a scrap of cloth and a sandwich bag. I think it's effective if you're willing to go through the process. I think it's helpful and gets you to a usable product a little quicker. But if you're not in a hurry, you can also just take your mixed Japanning, set it on the shelf for a week, and you'll have a good product there as well. So getting ready to actually Japan the plane. Number one rule, and I have made this mistake twice, and hopefully you will never make this mistake, is you have to Japan at least 72 degrees Fahrenheit. I would say working at around 76 degrees to maybe, 90 is better. If you're below 72 degrees Fahrenheit, the Japanning it loses a huge amount of its self-leveling property. And that means that includes the Japanning itself. So if you're storing it in a cool location, you need to let it warm up thoroughly before you use it. Your plane should be at temperature, and the environment you're working in should be warm enough to do it. If any of those three are below 72 degrees, preferably a little warmer than that, that's the minimum. The Japanning will not self-level before it starts to cure, or just kind of solidify as exposed to the air itself. And you will end up with kind of a wavy, lumpy finish on the plane that is virtually impossible to overcome. I have tried to overcome a finish like that. Once I did it and realized what I had done, I actually decided, well, here's a chance to figure out how can I help somebody solve this. I tried just about everything I can think of, every trick in the book, and I ended up stripping the plane. So just make sure you're at temperature before you apply the Japanning. Now, somebody recently that I was working with did apply the Japanning, and it was too cold. They did put the plane in the oven and put it on a really low heat cycle, and it did level out. And I've tried that. I have Japanned planes and realized afterwards, oh my goodness, it's colder than I thought. It's not leveling. Put it in the oven. It's most ovens that you put this stuff in, kind of the minimum temperature is going to be about 140, and that will potentially start to cure it before it levels. So it can be done. This gentleman was successful. He got a good finish as a result, but the window of success is very narrow. So try to avoid getting caught in that trap and just make sure everything is at least 72 degrees Fahrenheit. If you work in Celsius, it's about 23 degrees Celsius before you start Japanning, and that it's going to stay at that temperature throughout the process, because it's really a challenge if it's not.
Greg, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So in regards to the leveling of the Japanning.
Yeah.
Do you get a thinner coat on this? I guess the items that are vertical versus horizontal, or does it just run off the vertical surfaces, or once you start heating it?
So that's a good question. So summarizing the application process, you're going to do 3 to maybe 4 coats of Japanning on everything you Japan. Obviously, they didn't do multiple cycles when they were Japanning these things originally because they were dunked completely. I don't know how they were oriented. I'm experimenting with that to try to better understand Stanley's original process or any of the plane makers' original process. But they were completely submerged and then hung to allow the Japanning to drip off and then baked. And it was done in 1 coat. Now there's definitely variation in the thickness of Japanning on planes. Some of the old planes, you'll have one that's got, great Japanning, it's really well bonded, and others not so much. But we build it up in coats for a couple of reasons. Again, to try to keep you from running into a situation where the Japanning is a failure and you have to strip the plane. And here's what happens. If you put the Japanning on too thick, there's a couple things that are happen. It can sag or run on the vertical surfaces, either while it's just sitting and self-leveling, or while you're baking it, and it gets obviously a little bit thinner as it's heating, and then you'll end up with either like kind of a pool along the edge of the cheek in the bed, or you'll see almost like drips on the cheeks. If you put it on too thick, and that's not going to be a problem. I'll definitely show you how to avoid that. And if you plan on doing 3 coats, maybe 4, you will be putting it on thin enough that won't happen at all. The second thing that can happen if you get it on too thick is you can start to get blisters or that wrinkling as it cures, because it will tend to skin over faster than it can outgas. I think the way that was avoided in the past, when the factories were Japanning, is the planes were allowed to drip off for some period of time. They would recover the Japanning that was dripping off. They had drip trays next to the Japanning vats. Then they were loaded into big walk-in ovens until the oven was full. So it was probably an all-day process of loading japanned parts into these ovens. So you've got about 8 or 10 hours of basically just kind of room temperature curing going on. So the Japanning is getting a little firmer in the whole process. And then they would heat the ovens from a cold start. And they were coal-fired, wood-fired, whatever types of ovens that were running heat either through liquid pipe surrounds, or in some cases they were actually allowing the heat from the fires to circulate just outside the bricks of the oven. And that's how they blew them up, because you had flames in close proximity to large quantities of turpentine vapors. So it was a very slow heating process, and I think that allowed the turpentine and the Japanning to off-gas before it started to skin over, just because of the time frame. But we're trying to do this quickly, as fast as we can, because we're all impatient, but yet successfully. So I've tried to boil down the heat cycles to as few as possible and get to curing as quickly as possible, but without getting into that wrinkling or blistering effect. It is certainly possible to cure a plane faster than I'm going to tell you, but your margin for error gets narrower and narrower, and you end up with potentially a disastrous outcome. So again, long answer to a short question. By planning on doing 3 to 4 coats, you won't have that problem with sagging or drips on your plane, as long as you've got that kind of in mind. But you will be putting it on thick enough that you will get that self-leveling quality, and that's a pretty wide envelope to play in. The amount of Japanning it takes to self-level versus the amount of Japanning it takes to sag is a big difference. So you've got a pretty wide window in there for your technique to evolve. So it's not difficult. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I appreciate it. It goes back to what you said earlier. You need to experiment and practice and see what the results are, and you'll get a flavor of what works and what doesn't.
Right.
Again, we're just trying to understand through your experience what's the best way forward, and I appreciate it.
Sure.
Thanks.
No, absolutely. Yeah, there is. I mean, it is definitely, there's some technique involved, but it is not difficult technique at all. It really isn't. I mean, if you can paint the trim around your door and not have paint running down and pooling on the floor, you can Japan a hand plane. It is with the lessons I've learned and the way I've mapped it out, you've got a pretty wide playing field for success. So I wouldn't be too concerned. Although, you know, Dennis's idea of starting with a little block plane that he's not really invested in, didn't spend a lot of time cleaning it up and as a practice plane, absolutely. There's nothing wrong with that at all. That's great. A great way to learn your technique. But I know dozens and dozens of folks that have jumped right in with their favorite Stanley and have gotten good results. So,
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
You used the term disastrous results.
Yep.
My definition of that would be one that was sticky and never hardened up, and you had
Okay.
a mess.
Yeah.
But I think there could be less than perfect outcomes that you could still be usable, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And unless you go dramatically wrong with your mixing and, forget to add linseed oil or add significantly less than you want, you won't end up with a sticky mess at all. So yeah, what I consider a disastrous result is one that you're not satisfied with that kind of glassy, smooth, really deep black finish. You'll get, the results are impressive and it's not real difficult. So, but yeah, disastrous result is having, a real wavy, bubbly, lumpy, very lumpy finish from using Japanning that's too cold, or having blisters from, heating it way too fast. And you have to go pretty overboard to do that. Like put it in the oven and forget what you're doing and turn it on broil, you'll make a mess. But otherwise, as far as just getting to a protective coating that's black and usable, yeah, you can, your 10-year-old can do it for you, no problem. So.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. So, like I said, I think I want to actually apply some Japanning as I talk about it, so you can see a little bit of the technique. For whatever crazy reason, I decided to grab a number 8 plane. I guess I'm a glutton for punishment. So I'm not going to Japan the whole thing because that's going to take a while, but I will Japan part of it while we're going over this, and then I will finish applying Japanning and cure it later. So as long as I don't wait excessive period of time in there, which I won't, I can come back to it. So, and the first coat is a very thin coat anyways. Whoops. And I just dropped my brush on the floor. Pardon me.
Greg, I have a question while you're retrieving your brush.
Yeah, go ahead.
You just mentioned sort of.
Here we go. Go ahead with your question.
Right. You just mentioned partially applying and then coming back to it later. Is there a sort of a time beyond which you shouldn't wait? Yeah,
you want to, again, working on the theory of what do you need to do to have the greatest likelihood of success, you want to plan on Japanning an entire piece, either the bed of the plane or the frog of the plane or the lever cap of a block plane or whatever piece it is you're Japanning. You want to plan on putting a coat of Japanning on that entire item in one setting at one time. What I'm going to be doing with this plane is pushing the limits of success, right? But with experience, I know that I'm doing the first coat, which is extremely thin. So self-leveling is not really an issue on the first coat. I wouldn't try this with the second or third coat because you would likely see where I stopped and where I started if I wait more than maybe 20 minutes. Because after about 20 minutes, the Japanning starts to kind of skin over, and if you brush it at that point, you start to leave brush marks that start to get beyond the ability of the self-leveling to overcome. So, so we'll see that as I go here.
But better not tempt fate and plan on doing it in one fell swoop.
Yeah, don't tempt fate. But I mean, you don't have to do the frog and the bed of the plane at the same time. You can do those on different days.
Sure. Sure.
So, but it doesn't take long. That little plane that I just took off the grill. Now, again, I wasn't Japanning that for appearance. That's not a collectible plane. It's actually a chipped. It's a experimental piece that I play around with. You know, I've got half a dozen broken planes that I use to experiment with Japanning on, and it's one of them. So, but I put the Japanning on that probably in about 3 minutes. It didn't take any time at all. So doing a number 4 plane, taking your time, working hard to make sure, you know, you're getting the best finish, taking maybe 10 or 15 minutes to do the whole plane. So I'm just right now, let me switch over to the other camera so you can see what I'm doing. I've got my rag. I do not use paper towels for this part of wiping down your plane because they leave paper particles behind. But I'm just using a generous amount of acetone, and I'm not wearing my gloves. Whoops, I got my gloves on. But I'm just wiping down all the surfaces that are going to be japanned with acetone to make sure that I don't have any oils on there, any dust. You do try to work in a dust-free environment, as dust-free as you can get. And while we're on this subject, probably the third plane I japanned, I japanned it, but for whatever reason, I couldn't put it in the oven right away. I don't remember why. Maybe I was working on the oven or something. And so I set it on the back of my workbench, and it sat there for about 48 hours. And then I put it in the oven. Well, my workshop isn't dust-free. And I ended up with a finish that I stripped back off the plane because it accumulated a lot of dust. All that stuff got in the Japanning. The Japanning is sticky. There was even a fruit fly stuck in the Japanning. And so it made a mess. So my recommendation when you're going to Japan a plane is go from the Japanning process of applying it to putting it in the oven. I put them in the oven and let them sit. You give it time to self-level. Again, we'll talk about it in detail. But I do the self-leveling in the oven. The oven is a pretty dust-free environment. So I apply the Japanning, I put it in the oven, let it sit for 15 to 30 minutes so it can level out, and then I start the oven. All right. So this has been wiped down with acetone. So it's ready to go. I've got a can of Japanning that I have let sit for about 4 days since I moved it from my other shop. So even though it's been filtered, I know that it's settled. Good clean brush. Now, after you clean your brushes, once you've used them, they're stiff because you don't get all the Japanning out of them, but you can just kind of knock the bristles loose, and they're ready to go. Again, I tell you to wear gloves, and I'm going to put them on because while you're handling the plane, you don't want to leave a thumbprint somewhere. So let me get a pair of gloves on. Okay. It's really hard to show you the thickness of the Japanning. It's very difficult to convey that with a camera because the Japanning is so black, it doesn't even show up well on a camera. But this is, again, maybe just a little bit thicker than cheap store-bought maple syrup, which is really corn syrup that's colored, right, flavored. It's relatively thin. It's not as thick as honey, but anywhere in there you're fine. Anywhere between syrup and honey, you're fine. If it's like cold honey, you're too thick. So, anyways, pick up a little bit on the brush. Decide where you're going to start. We'll do the nose of the plane. We'll do the front of the plane first. So I usually start with the vertical surfaces. Again, we're doing the first coat, and I call it a brown coat, and I'll show you why, is because you're going to brush it out to the point that it looks more brown than black. It's not going to be the pretty finish that you're looking for in the end. So now I'm brushing up here because if I brush down, the Japanning is going to come off my brush and it's going to start to run down the back side right here. So I'm brushing up. I'm going to brush up along the cheek here. And I'm just making sure I get good coverage. I'm working it down into the pores of the plane. Goes pretty fast because this is all about adhesion and rust protection. This isn't about appearance, the first coat. And I'm not worried about getting it on the cheek up there because I'll wipe it off. And let me see if I can position this so you can watch me work on the other side. Let's see, like that. And I'll try to do it looking at the camera because I can't see what I'm doing, having the plane tilted that way. So this is exciting. Definitely you want a good clear workspace. Maybe it goes without saying, but I dumped a quart of Japanning in my workbench and on me. And it never comes out of clothing. So I have a pair of Japan tennis shoes, a pair of Japan Levi's, a Japan cabinet. So, because I had too much clutter on my workbench. All right, so I'm doing the top surface now, and around the lettering, you want to brush it out really well. It's easy to get too much Japanning in the lettering and have it pool up, and eventually, kind of over soften the lettering itself. If you ever want to know if a plane's japanned or spray painted, if it's been refurbished, look at the lettering. If it's been spray painted, if you're looking at buying a used plane and it's been spray painted, the lettering is going to be really, really crisp. Whereas the Japanning, because it's thicker, you'll see it has softened the lettering a little bit. But if you get it on too heavy, you'll just fill in the little tiny spots in your lettering. So I brush it out pretty good. All right, we'll finish this front section here in just a matter of a minute. So,
Hey, Greg,
yeah.
do we have to be careful of gloves with powder on them?
Yeah, I probably would be. Yeah. Which a lot of latex gloves do have that, like a talcum powder. So it's really fine. It probably wouldn't show up in the finish, but I would probably avoid it. You also want to be careful not to get a bunch of Japanning down inside the threaded fixtures on the plane. It's not a big issue if you do. You can you can work the threading back in, the bolt or rod or post back in there. It will cut through the Japanning, but the easiest way to do that is just make sure you don't have too much Japanning on your brush when you hit those surfaces, and kind of brush towards the hole. If you see, I'm going to brush always towards the hole and not across it where it would scrape all the Japanning off my brush and end up going down inside there. If you really overdo it, you can always, get a tap and just chase the threads, clean it out. Okay, let me turn this plane so I can see what I've done. I've missed a spot here on the cheek because I couldn't see from that angle. Okay, I see there's a kind of a casting imperfection right up here, which you may not be able to see. Let me see if I can move this back far enough for you to see. It's a pretty deep pit right here, casting imperfection. It doesn't show up there, but the Japanning did not get down in there, so I'm kind of poking at it to brush it down, to force it down in there. And I'm just going to finish up just with a couple of long brush strokes just to help remove any really bad brush marks I left, but most of them will just settle out really quickly on their own. A fairly even finish. If I see a spot that's, much blacker, much darker than all the rest, I'll just brush it out. But again, this is a thin coat and it's not too difficult to get it right. So, okay. And again, I'm going to try to see if I can get enough light on this so you can see. Yeah, you can kind of see there, particularly right down there. You see how that's brown and not black? Again, it's hard on a camera, but if you were to look at this plane in person,
We can see it.
Yeah, you would not be happy with the finish. You'd be like, well, that's not black at all. That looks kind of brown. Well, yeah, it is. That's why I call it a brown coat. And it's really just getting that first bond on there. It's also a good opportunity for you to get some experience applying the Japanning because it's an easy coat to put on. So that would be coat number one. Take my rag. I've got it, got it in the cheeks here. Here, we'll get a bunch on the cheek there. So, little turpentine. Now, at most Stanley planes, if you look at them, you'll notice the toe of the plane way up, where is it? Right up here was not japanned. Well, it was. I mean, it was the whole thing was japanned, but they machine that. They run that against that belt sander in the factories when they made them, and so the japanning was removed on that piece. But on the back of most of the Stanley planes, the back they did not do that same process on back here, and so the japanning usually remains on the back of the Stanley planes, particularly the ones that, like the smaller planes that have an irregular surface back there. They have this bump where the tote extends beyond. They couldn't run that against a machine to clean up the casting marks, so they just left it. And so you would have your japanning back there. All right.
That sounds like something good to look for when you're trying to buy a plane, as to whether it's been, worked on or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure would be. Okay, so I'm just taking my little rag with some turpentine on it, just wiping off the cheek rail. I'm going to look at the toe up here, make a quick pass across there. And that's first coat on the front of that plane. I do the rest of it and start the heat curing cycles, which we'll talk about here in just a second. So doesn't take any time. We're obviously working around the frog is a little trickier. That's really the only place that on the body of a plane that you've got anything to avoid is kind of where the frog mating surfaces are. But again, if you get japanning somewhere you don't want it, just wipe it off. If you end up wiping it off the bed of the plane with your turpentine and rag, that's no big deal. You can just go back and japan back over it. The turpentine is what's in the japanning, so it's not going to affect it. That's why I use turpentine to clean it up as I'm working. We'll do a little bit of the frog here, so you can see it is certainly more difficult. Again, keeping in mind what's machined and what's not. On the frog, the Y yoke is machined right at the tip, sometimes on both surfaces, sometimes just on one. And again, I don't know if it's so much machined as it's put against a sander to smooth it out because it's a bearing surface for the cutter. So this surface right here, I'll avoid japanning. I won't japan the tip here, and there's a little bit, I can see a little groove back here that indicates how far back they put this against the belt sander and sanded it or machined it. And so I won't japan back there, but I will japan from here back. And on this side, I'll japan from here on down. And then the sides of this piece were japanned. Obviously, the lateral lever is not japanned. Some planes do have japanned lever caps. Sargent did japanned lever caps on some of their planes for a couple of years. You can see here, this is a machined surface. It was milled out. So I won't japan these two surfaces. And obviously on a bedrock, the big flat base is milled. But this inset region right here would never have encountered the mill. So I'll japan in there, but not out here. In fact, that'd be a good place to start because it's a tight little spot and I'm sure to get japanning somewhere I don't want it. So we can take a look at how to deal with that. Let me get the really small brush here. We'll do some of the small detail areas that are more difficult. So got a pretty fine brush. It's actually finer than it looks once it gets japanning on it, and it kind of takes a point again. So, all right, so we'll do this little spot right here that for whatever reason had I don't know that much about bedrocks. Again, I'm not a Stanley guy, but there was an indentation in the casting for some reason. And so it would never have been machined. And I'm not going to worry about getting japanning on the milled section because it's such a small area, I can't avoid it. So I'm just going to make sure I get a good job, a good coat of japanning down in here. And then I'll just clean it up. So again, first coat, I'm putting it on very thin. And you can tell I've colored outside the lines. So you don't have to be skilled to do this. Pull the rag nice and tight and just wipe across the surface. Okay, and I went down in there a little bit with my finger and removed some of the Japanning. So I'm just gonna brush it back on there again and wipe it one more time. Right down here. Okay, that little detail is done. Another area, do this with the bigger brush, it's a little tricky on these things is where the frog screws or the pins on a bedrock go through. Those are obviously not machined inside there. That's rough casting, so you have to Japan that. So I'll just brush the Japanning on. Again, I'm going to get it on the machine surface, but I'll just wipe it off when I'm done. So we want to get a good coat, good penetration to prevent rust. A lot of people ask about spot repairing Japanning. I've got one little spot on this plane. I really like the plane. Can I just do that one spot? First of all, if you have an area on an old plane that the Japanning is turned loose or is missing Japanning, you're missing more Japanning than you realize. The reason that Japanning has come off is rust. You know, there was a chip or something and rust got under the Japanning, and it has spread beyond that which the Japanning is missing. So as you start to, you know, clean up that little area to Japan that one spot, you're going to find a lot more Japanning comes off around that area because it's been undermined by rust, which isn't to say you can't do a spot repair. You can. I won't get into the details of it because it's a lot of technique and it's slow. I don't recommend it. But if you really want to just fix one little spot on a plane and not affect anything else, it can be done. So again, the purpose of this first coat is to make sure I get down deep in the pores of the Japanning or the casting so that I will have really good rust protection. And the subsequent coats are all about appearance. Okay. And my rag doesn't really have enough turpentine on it, so we'll just put it on there again. Clean this up. Yep, there we go. So good clean surface here. And you can see where I've got the inside of those areas done. Now where the pins ride up here on top, I didn't really pay attention when I was cleaning this frog off, so I didn't know if those were milled or not, but I'm looking at it now and they are not. They're not milled, so at least doesn't look like it. Let me get my glasses because I didn't do a good inventory before I started this plane. So I should have paid closer attention. Let's see. No, I think that surface was machined. Yep. So where those pins set on a bedrock, and somebody can correct me if they've got a bedrock and know, I believe that this flat surface right here should not have Japanning on it because it looks like it was milled off to provide a good seating area for the bed or the head of the pins that hold the bedrock frog. So I'll wipe that back off. But in the meantime, I'll do this other area around here. And you don't have to be. I'm being kind of careless putting it on so I can demonstrate how to remove it. You don't have to be as careless as I am. I usually try to not get the Japanning in places I don't want it, but it's not a big deal if you do. Okay. All right. I don't have anything against Stanley planes. They're just not necessarily my thing. This is the only bedrock Stanley plane I've got. So this is the first time I've ever Japanned a bedrock, I think. I might have done one for somebody else, but not a lot of experience with bedrocks. An excellent tool, an excellent plane. Again, I don't have anything against them. I like the design. I've got other planes that use the bedrock design. Obviously, Lee Nielsen does, but it's a German manufacturer that copied a lot of the bedrock design in their planes, and I've got a number of those. And of course, Clifton is my favorite plane, and they're a bedrock design, so it's a great design. So, all right, well, this will be a little tricky because it's tight in there, but I can get my finger in there and clean that off. And in the future, on the other side, I will take more caution to not get Japanning on that surface in the first place. So I'll just use a little smaller brush so I don't have to clean it off because it's a little tight getting my finger in there. Okay. All right. And in so doing, I kind of wipe the Japan off. Okay, here we go. So now you can see, if you see some discoloration down here, that's because it's wet with turpentine from me just wiping it off. But there we go. So again, very thin coat, more brown than black. When you're doing the frog, when you go to put it in the oven or when you're working on it, I don't want to set it on the workbench here because this is cloth and it would get some dust on it. But you can lay it down on its face because all the Japan surfaces are recesses on the face. So you can lay it right on the face and nothing's touching the Japanning. When you go to put it in the oven to cure it, you can just set it on the rack on its face and cure it. If you try to stand it up this way, particularly on Baileys, they'll tip over and then you'll make contact with the grill and or whatever oven and mess up your Japanning. So just keep it on its face. All right, any questions about applying the first coat of Japanning? Is my audio still working?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it's working.
Okay. All right. Well, let's take a look. Let me see if this other plane is cooled enough to touch it. And if I scream, it hasn't. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. All right. So here's the one that I put in the barbecue grill. Now, again, I Japanned this very fast. I put it on much heavier than I normally would have for the first coat, and not as evenly as I normally would. If you look, you'll see as I get the light here, you may be able to see some areas that are brown. Not really. It doesn't show up very well. Right there, you can see that's kind of the brown that I would normally want, whereas most of this is got more Japanning on it, a little thicker than I would want. But let's take just giving it a quick look. I did not clean this plane up and make sure it was completely lint-free or dust-free before I Japanned it, but I got good self-leveling. So I would say that even though my temperature, okay, so here, let's talk about heat curing, because that's really the last big deal. The heat curing that I initially used was, I don't remember the gentleman's name. Somebody has done a YouTube video that was experimenting around with Japanning. He was doing tinware as a Civil War reenactor. I think it was him that recommended 3 different heat curing cycles, or 3 or 4 heat curing cycles, which is what I did initially. Then I decided that was taking a long time. I wanted to know if I could cut it down. So I worked at trying to condense down. Could I get to 1 heat curing cycle, or how quickly could I cure the plane and not have it, blister? And what I found and what I recommend as the safest but fastest heat curing cycle is 2 heat curing cycles. So you're going to start from a cold oven. You put your plane in the cold oven. So after you apply the Japanning, after you apply your Japanning, you want to let it sit for about 15 minutes at room temperature so it can self-level in a dust-free environment. Generally in the oven is the best place. So put it in there, let it sit for 15 to 30 minutes. It'll level out all that it's going to at that time frame, and then start your oven. The first heat curing cycle, you want to go to 180 degrees, no less than, and I would generally say, try not to go too much warmer, but right at 180 is what you're shooting for, 180 to 190. And you're going to let it run for 2 hours. After 2 hours, turn the oven off, let it cool down. Take your plane out. How does it look? Everything look okay? All right, it's going to go back in for a second cycle. The second cycle is also 2 hours long, but it's going to be at 350 to 375 degrees. If you can't get to 350, the Japanning does not reach that final hardness. That seems to be the key temperature, is 350. How hot you can go, I don't know. I would say don't get above 400 because I haven't, and I don't know what happens above 400. But 350 is the magic number. You're going to run for 2 hours with that. Again, you're going to start from a cold oven or relatively cool oven at this point, and bring the temperature up fairly slowly. On a commercial oven, if you put the plane in there and just set it to 350 and walk away, it's going to heat up way too fast. On a little toaster oven, probably okay. It'll heat up a little slower. But what I usually do is I'll heat it to 180 to 200 degrees, wait about 10 minutes because the cast iron is heating up. It's not the same temperature as the oven. It's got a certain thermal mass to it. So I'll get to around 200, wait 10 or 15 minutes, take it up to about 300 degrees, give it another 10 minutes, and then get to 350 and then start my 2-hour cycle at that point. So I'm raising the temperature a little bit gradually, knowing that the cast iron has to come up to temperature. A larger plane, like a number 8, might take a little bit longer to actually reach temperature. So then you run it for 2 hours at 350 degrees, 350 to 375. Shut it off, let it cool down. Once it's completely cool, you can take it out of the oven and you will have a good hard surface. And at that point, you start your next cycle. You apply your Japanning, next coat of Japanning, go through the whole process again. 180 for 2 hours, cool it off. 350 degrees for 2 hours, cool it off. Apply your next coat. And repeat the process until you have essentially the finish you want, the buildup, the thickness that you want. It is possible to skip the second heat cycle and apply Japanning after just going to 180 degrees, but I don't recommend it. Again, it's because the Japanning is not real hard. It tends to kind of grab the brush and start to create brush marks in the Japanning, particularly if you're having to brush it on very much. If you've done enough planes and you can essentially kind of put the Japanning on with 1 or 2 strokes of the brush and not have to go back to it, then you can get away without going to the full 350 heat cycle between every coat. But starting out, harden it off, do a 180 degree and a 350 degree heat cycle, then apply the next coat. It bonds perfectly well between coats to the previous coat. You won't have any separation or flaking. It's just as durable. And it's less air prone if you do it that way. So this one's only been through 1 cycle. It was at 180 degrees. The Japanning is still just a little sticky. At 180 degrees, I could leave a fingerprint in it. So if I brush the next coat on, if I brush more than 1 or 2 strokes, I'm going to start leaving brush marks in this semi-cured Japanning, and I'm not going to get as good a finish. So I wouldn't put the second coat on this one, even on a test bed plane. I'm going to go put it out there and run it 2 hours at 350, cool it off, and then I'll put the next coat on. And I'm going to go ahead and run this one through 4 coats of Japanning on the barbecue grill, just to make sure I don't run into any problems, but I think it'll work just fine. I told you that my grill, I was having trouble with it not getting too hot. And it was running about 200 degrees on this plane, and it doesn't look like it caused any problems at all. So I would say that initial heat curing cycle window is a little wider. And you can go probably up to about 225, but again, the target is 180. So if your grill doesn't want to stay at 180, it wants to stay at 200, it would still be a viable option for that first heat curing cycle, because I see no ill effects at all, no blistering at all. So. Any questions about that? All right, well, a couple of tips for getting a really good finish in the Japanning. Because we're putting it on a little thinner and building up coats, and because our Japanning hasn't sat in a Japanning tub for 10 years, like the Stanley plant, we're likely to have a few more undissolved particles or nibs, or sometimes what it really is casting imperfections, little bumps in the casting that is projecting through the Japanning, and we're not getting that really glassy finish that you want. If you want to really try to get the best possible mirror-like finish on the Japanning, After each coat, and you've gone to the full 350-degree heat cycle on each coat, maybe not the first coat, but the second, third, and fourth, when you're getting a buildup of Japanning, you can use the Japanning like a sandable primer and sand the flat sections of the plane in between coats. I usually would use an 800 to 1,000 or higher grit sandpaper, light pressure, very small pieces that I can just put up basically on the end of a finger and sand in there. But you can absolutely sand the Japanning between coats. And what you're really going to do is you're going to cut the Japanning down to the highest level of the casting. And what you'll find is as you do this, a lot of the little bumps, the nibs that you see, will turn silver, because what they really are is they're little bumps in the casting that's projecting up through the Japanning. So you're basically removing the Japanning off the high spots and allowing it to stay in the low spots. You add the next coat, you have a much smoother finish. If you want to go back and sand the next coat, you can do it again. I'll often sand between the second and third coats. And when I get the fourth coat on the plane, it's like a big black mirror. Doesn't take but a minute or two to sand it. You're not putting much pressure on. After you sand it, you just wipe it with turpentine. That gets any of the sanding dust off, and you're good to go, applying the next coat. So if you really want that super smooth surface that you imagine the plane looked like when it was new, that would be a recommended step, is use the Japanning as a sandable primer and sand between coats. As you build up the Japanning on there, be mindful of the lettering on the plane. Again, it's easy to get too much Japanning on the lettering and really kind of blur it out. So I brush it out. When I dip my brush in Japanning and I am applying it to the bed, I never go from the can directly to the letters, because your brush is carrying the maximum load of Japanning at that point, and you'll dump a bunch of it on your lettering. So I'll come out of the can to a larger area of the plane, brush that area out until my brush is not loaded with Japanning, and then work on the lettering. Because I like the lettering to be semi-crisp. And I certainly don't like to have, like in the word bedrock, have the B's filled in so it looks like it's a letter D or something. You get the idea. And I brush it out on the lettering. I think that gives you a little bit better finish. Keep in mind that you're gonna have a very high gloss finish, which may not be what you want. I guarantee you that's what the plane looked like when it left the factory, but that's not what we're accustomed to seeing on 100-year-old planes. If you like to have the patina on your plane, you don't really want the plane to look brand new, then you might want to scuff the Japanning back, so it's maybe better matches the age of your plane. And again, real fine sandpaper, I'd probably start with a 5,000 grit sandpaper, and you can wet sand the Japanning or dry sand it doesn't really matter, and kind of cut the sheen back to whatever you think is appropriate. If you cut it back too far and you don't like it, well, you basically just used your Japanning as sandable primer, wipe it all down with turpentine. I wouldn't use acetone at that point. I use turpentine in between coats to wipe down if I need to, and apply another coat of Japanning. And you haven't done any harm at all. So those are kind of the tips. I don't know what else to tell you. I think that's just about it. You can use your barbecue grill to cure a plane. Let me know how that goes. I will continue the experiment here and let you guys know if I run into any issues. But it's just another heat source, and I don't think there would be any issues using it. I did like I will, one quick tip. The first time I cured a plane in my kitchen oven, the kitchen oven I used at the time was gas, not electric. And gas produces some moisture when it combusts anyways. I live in a very humid environment. It was a very humid day. I put the plane in the cold oven, turned the oven on, and I'm sure it produced quite a bit of moisture inside the oven. And all the unjapanned surfaces of my plane that were already lapped and cleaned flash rusted. So what I'll do now, if I'm like on the barbecue grill, or if I have a gas oven, I use an electric oven, but I would go ahead and start the oven first, let it heat up to maybe 100 degrees and kind of heat off some of the humidity. Let it cool down just a little bit. As long as you're under 100 degrees, you're fine. Put the plane in at that point, and then you can let it self-level and then start your heating cycle. But that gets the moisture out of the oven and avoid some of the flash rust. I wouldn't put rust preservative oils or something on the outside of the plane to prevent that, because you have a much higher risk of getting that into your Japanning. So that's about it. I think that's about all I know on Japanning, folks.
Thank you, Greg. That was very good. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Hey, Greg,
Yes, sir.
let me give you a little setup. You talked about chasing threads with Japanning in the threads. Where would you get those taps or dies?
Okay, fair enough. Yes, quite a while back, there were a few companies that carried taps and dies for Stanley. If you guys have ever looked into it, they use somewhat proprietary designs on their threads on these old planes, and nobody was carrying those parts anymore. So some of us got together a big enough order to buy those parts that I contacted a manufacturer and had taps and dies made. And there's been enough interest in it that I continue to stock the taps and dies for Stanley bench planes. The same ones cover most of the record planes. I don't necessarily have taps and dies for all Stanley planes. I don't know what the threads are on a Stanley 45 or something like that. But if you need a tap or die for a Stanley bench plane, I have all those in stock. They are not cheap. They're custom made tools, and they are basically, I spec them out to the highest standard because I like good tools. So they're all high-speed steel. They're bottoming taps for all the blind holes where a normal tap would punch the bottom out of your plane and ruin it. They're bottom taps for the captured holes. They're adjustable dies, so you can adjust them because there's some variability in the threads on these things. So yeah, they're high-end tools. They're custom made in Michigan for me, and but they're available on the website, aplanelife.us. I've got pretty much all of them in stock. There's one I don't stock. I don't remember what it is, but it's something that I can't imagine anybody would ever need. You'd have to have a lathe to turn your own. I think it's one of the frog adjusting screws if you needed to cut the threads on one. At any rate, you'll never have a need for it. But they're there. They're available. They're generally in stock. If I do run out of stock, it's generally a pretty lengthy period to get them back in stock. Usually takes about 12 weeks for the company to tool up and produce them, because they're mostly a British standard Whitworth thread, or their thread counts that nobody makes anymore, like the 1220 for the tote and knob. So yeah, if you need to chase the threads on a plane or on one of the parts, and you're looking for the taps and dies, you can go on the website and find them there. If you're not in the US, the website doesn't calculate international shipping. Just shoot me an email. I'll figure out what it'll cost to ship it to you, and I'll ship it to you anywhere in the world. I've shipped stuff, those tools, wherever people need them. So happy to do it. And if you don't want to mix your own Japanning, I've got some in stock. I don't have much left, honestly. I've got about, I think, 6 of these small cans. I think they're about $17-ish plus shipping. Normally I would say, well, I can always make more, but my shop, which has been dismantled and is being moved, is currently in a state where I can't mix any more Japanning right now. So if I run out before I get the shop put back together, there may be a bit of a delay in having actual Japanning available for sale if you want to buy it and not mix it. But by all means, have fun mixing it. I think that's part of the pleasure. If for any reason you don't want to do it, the stuff I sell is exactly what I use on my planes. I just grab a can and it's what I use. So, any other questions? Well, we've wrapped this up in 2 hours. I hope it wasn't too fast. I will post this video. I hope I didn't miss any of it in the recording process. I'll post this video on the website of Plain Life. I'll shoot a link out to everybody that was expressed interest in this. So you'll have a link to that or the YouTube video, YouTube channel that this will be on. It may take me 48 hours to get it posted. If you just can't wait that long, there are the recordings of my 3-day seminar already on the website. I think each recording is about an hour long that goes into all this detail and then some on the process. There may be some differences because since last time I did a seminar, I've learned a few things. And so this would be the most current information. And by all means, if you ever have any questions, feel free to email me. You can email me at aplainlife@comcast.net. You can email me through the website, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have as you're working through this. And if need be, always happy to jump on a Zoom call with somebody and try to help them overcome any issues. So I hope you give it a try. I know you'll be successful. Pretty much everybody has been, and enjoy putting a traditional finish on an old plane.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great
Thank you
job.
all. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Greg.
You too.